being disruptive and making passengers uncomfortable.
Sir, she says you've been refusing to comply. You can ask anyone on this plane. I haven't raised my voice.
Yeah, sure. Just so you know, there may have been an upgrade error. This is first class.
I'm aware this is my assigned seat, and I've already shown my boarding pass and ID to you twice.
Well, I need to see your boarding pass again.
Yep. I'm in seat 2A. You checked and confirmed it when I boarded, ma'am. All right, let's all calm down.
Julie Archer had worked that cabin for 11 years without ever once being wrong. Or so she believed. She was looking directly at a chest full of combat service medals and seeing a problem to be solved. Rhodes said nothing. He simply placed his military ID on his knee and waited. He had been patient in places that would have broken her. What Archer called a disruption, the officers who boarded that plane called nothing at all. She had just filed a false complaint against a consequence she hadn't recognized yet. Staff Sergeant Brendan Rhodes had not stumbled into the life he was living. He had built it, brick by brick, sacrifice by sacrifice, in places most Americans would never see and could not pronounce. He had enlisted in the United States Marine Corps at 18, driven by a sense of duty that was not performative. It was structural, load-bearing, the kind that does not bend under pressure because it was forged in it. 3 combat deployments, 2 formal commendations, a chest of service medals that represented years of decisions made under conditions where the wrong choice meant someone did not come home. He was traveling home on fully authorized military travel orders. His first-class seat had been assigned through official channels, paid for through proper procedure, and confirmed at the gate like every other passenger on the aircraft. There was nothing irregular about his presence on that plane. There was nothing irregular about anything, except to one person in that cabin. There was. Julie Archer had worked for the same airline for 11 years. In that time, she had developed the quiet confidence of someone who had never been seriously challenged in her domain. She was efficient. She was professional. And she had cultivated, without ever naming it, a finely tuned instinct for sorting people, for deciding, in the span of a glance, who carried themselves like they belonged in first class and who was an anomaly requiring closer inspection. It was not a policy. It was not written anywhere. It had simply never cost her anything. That was the fundamental miscalculation at the center of everything that followed. Archer had operated for over a decade on the assumption that her instincts were accurate, and her authority was total. She had never encountered a situation where both of those assumptions were wrong simultaneously, publicly, and on camera. The boarding door was still open when she first looked down the aisle and found Rhodes in seat 2A. The cabin was still filling. Passengers were lifting bags into overhead compartments, settling into their seats, ordering pre-departure drinks. Everything was routine. Archer's eyes settled on Rhodes. Something in her expression shifted. Not dramatically, not in a way anyone would have noted at the time. But the decision had already been made. She moved toward him. The first approach was framed as routine. Archer walked to seat 2A with the brisk efficiency of someone performing a standard task and asked Rhodes to verify his boarding pass. It was the kind of request that could plausibly pass as procedural, except that it wasn't being made to anyone else. Not the man in 2B, not the woman in 1A. Not a single other passenger in the first-class cabin was asked to produce documentation before the plane had even finished boarding. Rhodes handed over his boarding pass without a word. He watched her study it, longer than the act of reading it required, her eyes moving between the printed information and his face in a way that had nothing to do with verification and everything to do with assessment. She handed it back without an apology, without an acknowledgement, and moved on. Rhodes noted it. He said nothing. The second approach was harder to frame as routine. Archer returned to seat 2A several minutes later, and this time she did not lower her voice. In a tone audible to the surrounding rows, she asked Rhodes whether he was certain he was in the correct section. She asked whether there might have been an upgrade error. She asked if he had any additional documentation that could confirm his seat assignment. The cabin, in the way that enclosed spaces do during moments of social friction, became subtly quieter. Passengers who had been absorbed in their own pre-flight rituals began to pay attention. Rhodes felt the full weight of what was happening. He had lived long enough and moved through enough rooms where he was the only face that looked like his to recognize this particular choreography. The repeated requests, the manufactured doubt. The performance of suspicion conducted in public, designed, consciously or not, to make the target feel that the burden of proof was entirely theirs to carry. He had encountered this dynamic long before he ever put on a uniform. The uniform, it turned out, had changed very little. He responded with the measured calm of a man trained to function under conditions far more threatening than this. He confirmed, clearly and without hostility, that his seat was correct, that his orders were legitimate, and that he had boarded through the same process as every other passenger on the aircraft. Archer's jaw tightened. She was not satisfied. She told him she needed to check with the gate. Archer disappeared toward the front of the aircraft. The cabin exhaled slightly in her absence. Passengers exchanged glances, some uncertain, some already beginning to form conclusions about what they had just witnessed. Rhodes sat still. He did not pull out his phone. He did not lean over to speak to anyone. He simply waited, with the particular stillness of someone who has learned that composure in the right moment is its own form of power. When Archer returned, she did not bring an apology. She brought escalation. She told Rhodes that the gate agent had raised concerns and that she would now require his military identification in addition to the boarding pass she had already reviewed and confirmed. Her tone carried no acknowledgement that this was an extraordinary request. No other passenger on the aircraft had been asked for a second form of documentation. No other passenger in the first-class cabin had been subjected to a single round of questioning, let alone two, but Archer delivered the request with the calm certainty of someone who believed she was on solid institutional ground. Rhodes reached into his uniform and produced his government-issued military identification. He handed it to her. A combat veteran, decorated, in full-dress uniform, providing credentials to a flight attendant who had already verified he belonged exactly where he was sitting. Because she had decided, for reasons she had not articulated and could not legally justify, that one more layer of proof was required. What she had not noticed, or had noticed and dismissed, was that she was no longer performing for an empty room. Phones had come out. Passengers who had initially observed with passive curiosity were now recording with the quiet deliberateness of people who understood that what they were watching might matter later. The footage being captured in those rows would ultimately travel farther than that aircraft ever would. Archer did not modify her behavior. She reviewed Rhodes's military ID with the same slow, searching attention she had given his boarding pass, and returned it without comment. She was operating with complete confidence in her own authority. She had held that authority for 11 years without consequence. She had no framework for what was coming. The possibility that she was wrong, catastrophically, publicly, and permanently wrong, had not entered her calculus. Not yet. Every factual basis for the interrogation had now been eliminated. Rhodes's boarding pass was valid. His military identification was genuine. His seat assignment was confirmed by the airline's own records. He had been cooperative at every point, calm at every point, and had provided every document requested without protest or confrontation. There was nothing left for a reasonable person to question. Archer picked up the phone and called the gate. She told the gate agent that she had a disruptive passenger in first class who was refusing to comply with crew instructions. The description was not an exaggeration. It was not a mischaracterization born of confusion or stress. It was factually, documentably, and completely false. Made in real time, in front of a cabin full of witnesses, several of whom were still recording. Multiple passengers heard the call. Multiple passengers would later give formal statements confirming what they heard and what they had witnessed in the minutes preceding it. Their accounts were consistent with each other and consistent with the footage. Rhodes had been calm. He had been cooperative. He had refused nothing. The only thing he had done was exist in a seat that Archer had decided he did not belong in, and then systematically prove, at every turn, that she was wrong. What Archer had just done, the specific act of contacting the gate with a fabricated complaint in order to trigger law enforcement involvement against a passenger who had broken no rule and violated no policy, was not merely a professional error. It was the creation of a paper trail. It was the establishment of a record. Every word she had said in that cabin, every request she had made, every moment captured on those phones, it was now connected to an official action that would require documentation, witness statements, and institutional response. She believed she was about to resolve the situation in her favor. She believed that the arrival of law enforcement would validate her authority and conclude the encounter on her terms. She had just made the defining mistake of her career in front of an audience while being recorded. 2 airport police officers boarded the aircraft. They moved through the cabin with the purposeful efficiency of people responding to a reported disruption, scanning for the elevated tension, the raised voices, the visible signs of conflict that such calls typically produced. They found none of it. At seat 2A, they found Staff Sergeant Brendan Rhodes seated calmly, his boarding pass and military identification already resting in his lap. He had not been told to prepare them. He had simply anticipated this moment, not with anxiety, but with the quiet readiness of someone who understood that documentation, in situations like this one, was the most effective language available to him. He had learned that lesson long before he ever wore a uniform. The officers reviewed his documents. They asked him a small number of questions. Rhodes answered each one directly, without embellishment, without complaint, and without raising his voice. The exchange lasted only a few minutes. It did not take long because there was nothing to investigate. The boarding pass was valid. The orders were legitimate. The seat was assigned. The passenger had done nothing. One officer, according to testimony later provided by a passenger seated across the aisle, exhaled in a way that communicated his conclusion before he had spoken a word. His posture changed. The alertness that had carried him down the aisle softened into something closer to discomfort, not directed at Rhodes, but at the situation itself, at the obvious, unavoidable gap between what had been reported and what was actually in front of him. The officers did not remove Rhodes. There were no grounds to remove him. There was no disruption, no policy violation, no legitimate complaint that could support any enforcement action. The cabin remained silent. Passengers who had watched the entire sequence, the boarding pass, the military ID, the phone call, and now this, sat with a collective understanding of what they had witnessed. Several phones were still recording. Archer stood nearby. For the first time since she had approached Seat 2A, the certainty that had carried her through every escalation was no longer visible on her face. Something had shifted. The leverage she had been certain she held was gone, and in the silence of that cabin, at cruising altitude, she was beginning to understand why. The footage did not wait for the plane to land. Passengers had been recording since Archer's second approach to Seat 2A, and at least 2 of them uploaded the video before the boarding door closed. By the time the aircraft reached cruising altitude, the clip was already moving through social media with the velocity that only genuine outrage can produce. It required no caption. It required no context. The footage told its own story with the kind of unambiguous clarity that is almost impossible to counter. A uniformed, decorated combat veteran seated calmly in a legitimately assigned first-class seat, being interrogated, subjected to repeated documentation demands, and ultimately threatened with removal by law enforcement. For nothing. The comments sections filled within the hour. Veterans posted their own travel stories. Active service members expressed recognition. Civil rights organizations cited the incident in formal statements. Several members of Congress responded publicly before the day was over, using language that was not measured or diplomatic. The national news pickup happened fast. Networks ran the footage alongside coverage of military service and racial profiling, two subjects that together command the kind of broad, cross-demographic attention that airline public relations departments are not equipped to manage. The airline's customer service lines jammed. Their social media accounts became a documentation wall for people sharing similar experiences and demanding specific named accountability. What amplified the outrage beyond the reach of most profiling incidents was the specificity of what Archer had done. She had not targeted an anonymous private citizen. She had targeted a man whose rank, whose medals, and whose government-issued orders represented the most unimpeachable documentation of legitimacy that American society formally recognizes, and she had treated all of it as insufficient. The public understood immediately that if this could happen to him, with all of that, it could happen to anyone who shared his complexion and could not offer the same institutional armor. The airline said nothing publicly on the first day. Their silence was noted, catalogued, and added to the mounting record. The airline placed Julie Archer on suspension within 48 hours. The internal investigation that followed was not the slow, procedural review that institutions typically conduct when they believe time will dilute the pressure. It was accelerated, driven by the volume of witness statements pouring in from passengers on the flight, the existence of multiple unedited video recordings taken from different angles, and the speed at which the story had already embedded itself in national coverage. The passenger statements were consistent across the board. Every account confirmed the same sequence: the unprompted documentation demands, the repeated escalations, the absence of any disruptive behavior from Rhodes at any point, and the fabricated complaint made to the gate agent. There were no contradicting accounts. There was no version of events that supported Archer's characterization of Rhodes as disruptive or non-compliant. The investigation produced the conclusion that the evidence made inevitable. Archer was terminated. The airline's official statement cited violations of company non-discrimination policy and a breach of the protocols governing when cabin crew were authorized to request law enforcement involvement with a passenger. Both findings were significant, but the second carried particular institutional weight because it established that Archer had not merely behaved badly. She had misused an official mechanism, filing a false complaint that triggered a law enforcement response against a passenger who had done nothing wrong. Rhodes retained legal counsel. His attorneys filed a formal complaint with the Department of Transportation under 49 U.S.C. Section 4127, the federal statute that explicitly prohibits air carriers from subjecting passengers to discrimination on the basis of race, color, national origin, religion, sex, or ancestry. They filed a concurrent civil action against the airline under 42 U.S.C. Section 1981, which protects every person's equal right to make and enforce contracts, including the right to occupy a seat that has been lawfully purchased and confirmed, regardless of race. The airline did not issue a public statement contesting the claims. The filing of those two legal instruments, against the backdrop of viral footage and a completed internal investigation, had made the terrain of a contested legal fight very clear. The civil claim never reached a courtroom. The airline, facing simultaneous exposure on three distinct fronts: federal regulatory scrutiny, a civil action backed by eyewitness testimony and video evidence, and a reputational crisis that was still generating daily coverage, made the calculation that litigation would cost them more than resolution. The settlement was reached without a trial. The financial payout to Rhodes was confidential. But the non-monetary terms of the settlement were not, and they carried consequences that reached beyond Rhodes himself. The airline issued a formal, public written apology addressed directly to Staff Sergeant Brendan Rhodes, not a corporate statement about values, not a vague acknowledgement of concern, but a named, specific apology to the man they had failed. They committed to mandatory anti-bias retraining for all cabin crew, to be completed within a defined timeline and subject to third-party verification. They implemented a revised protocol requiring supervisory approval before any flight crew member could initiate law enforcement contact involving a passenger, eliminating the unilateral authority that Archer had exploited. The Department of Transportation's compliance review, triggered by Rhodes's federal complaint, produced findings that extended the consequences far beyond one flight attendant and one flight. Investigators examined the airline's internal records for enforcement-related incidents over a multi-year period. The data revealed a statistically significant disparity. Black passengers had been flagged for law enforcement contact at a disproportionate rate compared to white passengers in circumstances that were otherwise identical. The incident involving Rhodes had not been an isolated aberration. It had been a visible expression of a documented pattern. The compliance review resulted in binding corrective requirements imposed on the airline. Not recommendations, not voluntary commitments, but mandated reforms with federal oversight attached. The DOT's findings became part of the public record. They were cited in subsequent congressional testimony about racial discrimination in commercial aviation. The encounter in Seat 2A had generated a legal and regulatory footprint that would outlast the headlines by years. Julie Archer did not work in commercial aviation again. Her termination was documented in two separate public records: the airline's official statement, which named the policy violations that led to her dismissal, and the Department of Transportation's compliance findings, which referenced the incident in clinical but unambiguous terms. Those records did not expire. They did not fade. In an industry where employment history and regulatory standing are subject to intercarrier review, her name was now attached to a documented racial discrimination incident that had resulted in federal intervention and institutional reform. The professional network that had insulated her for 11 years collapsed the moment her conduct became a matter of public and federal record. The industry closed. Brendan Rhodes flew home. In a national interview conducted in the weeks following the settlement, he was asked how he had managed to remain calm through the entire encounter, through the repeated demands, the false complaint, the arrival of law enforcement, the full weight of a system being used against him in front of an audience. He paused before answering, not because he was searching for the words, but because the answer was simple, and he wanted to give it the space it deserved. He said he had been in situations where staying calm was the difference between life and death. This, he said, was not one of those situations. He had simply done what he was trained to do, assessed the environment, controlled what he could control, and trusted that the truth, documented, witnessed, and recorded, would be sufficient. He sat in his seat. He showed his credentials. He told the truth. And 11 years of unchallenged assumptions came apart in the first-class cabin of a domestic flight, because one man refused to be anything other than exactly who he was.